Good evening, friends. Thank you so much for joining us. Tonight, we know that there's going to be a few more people popping in on Jewish Standard Time, of course, but we don't want to waste the time of those of you who joined us early. We certainly don't want to waste Dr. McBride's time. It is such a privilege, and this isn't a joyous situation, of course, but and I certainly wish that I could introduce you to our community under better circumstances, but any opportunity to introduce Dr. Jared McBride to our community is a welcome one. Dr. McBride is an historian who specializes in the regions of Russia, Ukraine, and Eastern Europe in the 20th century. His research includes nationalist movements, mass violence, the Holocaust, interethnic conflict, and war crimes prosecution, basically all the really pleasant parts of Eastern European history in the 20th century. He's published widely. He has worked for the USC Shoah Foundation, Columbia University, the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. He's currently working on a book working on local perpetrators and interethnic violence in Nazi-occupied Western Ukraine. He's currently an assistant adjunct professor in the history department at UCLA. I'm sure there's a couple things that I'm not remembering, but I think you get the picture. He's very smart. He's very amazing. He's my friend and a privilege to welcome to speak on this subject. Friends, we're going to be getting your questions tonight, but first we thought we'd let, do you want Dr. Jared? How do we do this formally?
Jared's fine.
Jared's fine. We thought we'd let Jared start off just with a sort of connecting the dots for us. I know some of you have already been on many of the webinars that we've provided through WISE, but an historian's look at what's been happening in Ukraine and sort of how that brings us to the present day might be warranted. And then we'll have time for your questions. When the time comes, at the bottom of your screen, there's actually a little bubble called Q&A. You can submit questions through there and we will review them and we will get as many of them answered as we can by Jared this evening. So Jared, to you.
All right. So thanks, Rabbi Knobel or Josh. Thanks for the invitation. It's a real. I really appreciate having the opportunity to speak with all of you and answer some questions and have a discussion about this topic. I have not done the math on this, but I have been living in, traveling to, and spending a lot of time in Ukraine as well as Russia, but Ukraine since the mid 2000s. It's a place very near and dear to my heart, mainly through my work, but also when you're a historian or you're a scholar, you end up spending a lot of time in these places and making connections with people there. And as Josh said, obviously a lot of my work focuses on some very dark pages of Ukrainian history, and I'm happy to get into some of those discussions tonight or some of that history tonight as well. But I just do want to put it out there that it means a lot to me to have these conversations with people in the community, because it's a place that I care about. And obviously the horrific events over the last 6 weeks now have affected a lot of people very, very close to me in a personal way. And so anyway, with all that said, thank you for having me. So in terms of introductions and the ways I've done this in the past with some of these more general discussions, interactions, is to provide you a little bit of history. Now, as historians, we love to periodize things. We love to conceptualize how to package the past in a way that's edible, I guess, for our different audiences. And so whether that's 18-year-olds or graduate students or the general public. And so there's a lot of ways we could approach this story. I was recently, during all of these events in the last 6 weeks, I think I was in one media appearance. I was asked to explain the history of Ukrainian-Russian relationship in, 2.5 minutes on the news, cover 1,000 years. I'm not going to do that now. I hope I never have to do that again. So yes, we could go back, we could start 1,000 years ago. We're not going to do that. We could go back to the Soviet period, the 20th century. I'm happy to dip into that in the discussion today. We could go back to the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union and Ukraine gaining independence in 91 to the present. Happy to dip into that. It's still a little bit too much. We could go back to the Orange Revolution, which some of you, I'm sure all of you are adults, start when that happened in 2005, and maybe that's a little vague. But I'm not going to start there. But where I am going to start, this last periodization, and the most recent one would just be 2014 to present. And that's just, I think, just to lay a little bit of groundwork and foundation for the discussion. But as I just said, we can dip into all those other different time periods in the discussion, and I'm happy to speak to anything I can, or let you know what I can't speak to. So the reason I want to go back to 2014 is it's obviously has the closest roots to the war at present. And perhaps a lot of you remember some of the images of the events of what was referred to as the revolution on the Maidan, or the Maidan revolution, which began at the end of 2013. And then really kind of exploded into the beginning of the year of 2014. Some of you probably remember these images of fires burning and tires burning and snow coming down. There was actual shootings that happened in this central square in Ukraine, and that of those events in Kiev in 2014 directly kind of help us understand the war and the events that we've seen over the last 6 weeks. So I'm going to dive right into it. Again, jot anything down that you would like to go back to, and I'm going to hit maybe 4 or 5 points about those events and bring us up into the present, to the current war. So by 2013, Ukraine had been independent since 1991. There had been a host of issues in the country, economically, politically, socially, and otherwise. I won't get into many of them right now. Let's just say per capita national income in terms of purchasing power was 127th out of 213 countries. This was barely beating out Kosovo. 71% of the country thought that Ukraine was moving in the wrong direction. So there was a lot of dissatisfaction among many sectors of Ukrainian society by the time we find ourselves at the end of 2013. The president is Viktor Yanukovych. Some of you perhaps remember him. He is the villain of this part of the story. He was president since 2010. He came from this region in the east, which has been a part of a lot of the dispute and the conflict over the last, well, basically, I would say since 2005, called the Donbas region. This is a Russian-speaking region that lies on the borders with Russia. He came from a party that came from this particular region. Now, Yanukovych had been in negotiation with the European Union. So what's interesting, and I think important to note about this distinction between the Maidan Revolution and the current war, which we've all, I assume all of you as well, have learned a lot about NATO in the last 6 weeks, that this dispute at what sparks the Maidan Revolution, and really I think the events that bring us to today, actually had to do with the European Union, not NATO, right? So Yanukovych and the European Union are in discussion about not joining the European Union, but signing something called an association agreement, which was trying to put Ukraine on the track to eventually join EU. Now, Russia, who had a general, and their leader Putin had a general interest of keeping Ukraine in their orbit politically, which they had accomplished since Yanukovych was very sympathetic to Russia, as well as economically and socially as well. And so Russia had been pushing back and did not want Ukraine to sign this association agreement and wanted them to have a closer relationship with Russia. It looks as if, despite this, that Yanukovych, perhaps either because he thinks this is what's best for the country, which maybe it was, it looks as if he's going to sign this association agreement with the EU, and this is going to again lay the groundwork for a future relationship. Doesn't mean they're exactly going to join EU tomorrow. At the last minute, he backs out of this agreement. This is going to, in which seems he's going to now turn his attention back to Russia, or continue to stay with Russia is a better way to put it. This is going to lead to protests on the central square in Kiev. Often this is referred to as the Maidan. It's actually an Arabic word. It means square. This is a central square in downtown Kiev, not far from a number of the government buildings. Now, most of the people protesting were young folks. This is people, part of this 71% who probably saw the country as going in the wrong direction, wanted to integrate for a number of different reasons with Western and Central Europe rather than turning its attention to Russia. The protests will be quite small early on. And this is in the final days of 2014. And it is only when Yanukovych sends his security police into the square to try to clear the square and try to end these protests and try to stamp them out. And this also has to do, I think it's important to keep in mind, this also has to do with the background of the Orange Revolution, where there had been a previous revolution on the square. He tries to clear the square out. Now, the response to this is there's a lot of violence, and a lot of young folks, college kids, are beaten up by the police. Ukrainian people of all ages and backgrounds throughout the country are going to see this repression and are going to respond. And in response to this repression, the protests are going to grow by a magnitude that's almost unimaginable. So throughout the country, mostly the central part of the country and the western part of the country, as well as in Kiev, the protests are going to balloon, and millions of people around the country, hundreds of thousands of people millions of people are going to protest, and hundreds of thousands of people are going to occupy public spaces as a form of protest. Now, not all of these protesters were bent on joining the European Union and NATO, right? It's important to keep in mind that there's complexities to protest movements and public and these kinds of social movements. It's not always one issue, as you perhaps have seen in your own lives, even here in the United States. Some people, they're just dissatisfied with the political system. They're dissatisfied with their job prospects and all kinds of other issues. But this, at least the spark that led to this, will involve the European Union. An interesting polling at this time, about 42% of people wanted to join the European Union, and 37% this customs union with Russia. So again, it's even though you see these large protests on the TV and you see this pull towards the West, and this becomes a narrative, it's a little bit more complex to that on the ground when you're talking about taking the temperature of the entire population. So what happens is the protests continue. We have basically a stalemate. They're not going anywhere. They're not interested in going anywhere. The Yanukovych government is not interested in breaking this agreement that they've signed with Russia, or that they promised to sign with Russia, and go back towards the European Union. The real turning point is going to be in February. So the protests have been going on for a couple months now in the square. People have been freezing. It is cold in Kiev in the winter, I can promise you that. And the security police are eventually going to use live ammunition. Now, there's a lot of controversy about who made this decision, how this decision was made, but they were going to use live ammunition on protesters. Now, we think some of the protesters, a couple of them may have had weapons, few if any. This was a massacre by the government. 100 people are going to be killed as a result of this violence by the government. Yanukovych is going to lose support of the military, as well as the security services and other people who are basically keeping him in power at this point. He is going to flee across the border to Russia, of course, of all places, as a result of this violence against the protesters. And this is going to this will be the end of at least this phase of this revolution in central Kiev. So this is a collapse of this government. This is a government that had been sympathetic to Russia. And so the Russians not only now are not going to have Ukraine join this customs union with them to stay within their economic orbit, they've also now lost a party that they saw as sympathetic, and a leader as they saw sympathetic to their interest in Ukraine. The response by the Russians and by Putin is going to be quite swift. In the matter of weeks, we're going to see Russia seize Crimea. I'm sure many of you remember these events. This is the kind of famous event with the little green men. These are Russian soldiers who are not wearing their proper insignia to designate them as Russian soldiers. And of course, we all knew they were Russian soldiers, would appear in Crimea and basically push out the military. There's very little violence in the siege of Crimea. They would hold sham elections in the following month, in which 98% of people, quote unquote, voted to join Russia, and Crimea will be annexed by Russia at this time. So this is a direct response and retaliation by Russia against Ukraine for the events of the Maidan and these series of just almost catastrophic events that are going to happen in Kiev at this time. So as following up on Crimea, we're then going to see the theater, or the kind of attention turned towards the Donbas. And as I already mentioned, the Donbas is this region in the east. It's the industrial region of Ukraine. It had been in sort of a Soviet heartland, or I always refer to it as the Soviet Pittsburgh. My one friend from Pittsburgh said to stop saying that, but he's not here, so I'll say it anyway. So this very sort of heavily industrialized working class area, Still majority Ukrainians are ethnic Russians in this region, majority Ukrainians, but most people are Russian speaking. Most people have close ties to Russia. So what the Russians are going to seek to do is to foment a similar type of protest or social movement in this region to capture local government. So they're going to use locals, people, separatists, who some people from this population are separatists. A small minority of people in the Donbas wanted to break away from Ukraine, very small. Some of them also probably wanted more autonomy within the country or had grievances about language laws or things like this. They are going to push to take over government buildings and try to foment a larger sort of social revolution in the east, and perhaps try to light their own spark that this will go to other Russian-speaking cities like Odessa, like Mykolaiv, like Kharkiv, the cities that you're seeing now shelled by the Russians and destroyed, these Russian-seeking cities. So this was at least the game plan of Russian intelligence and also some of these separatist forces, although of course we know this is being directed out of Russia. This is not the case. This is not what happens. The Russians are actually forced to send a number of their own people and intelligence officers in the Donbas to try to foment these uprisings and these revolutions to try to cleave off these areas from Ukraine. Eventually, they are going to also arm these separatists, and these separatists are going to begin to take hostile actions towards local governments through the use of force. The Ukrainian government, which you keep in mind, the Ukrainian government had just collapsed, so they had an interim government and they needed to have elections. They've just lost a huge historic territory. I'm now dealing with a possible separatist movement or revolution, or at least intervention from Russia, I think is the best way to put it, in the eastern part of the country. And so they are going to have to mobilize their military, which of course has not fought a war ever. The Ukrainian military has not fought a war as such as an independent country at all. The last time these people had seen conflict had been probably Afghanistan, the Soviet war, right? And let's just say there hadn't been a lot of investment in the military. Now have to basically put together a military operation to intervene in the Donbas to try to stamp out this separatist movement. And this is going to lead to this conflict and this fighting, right? And so we saw the heaviest fighting throughout 2014 and 15, and then this kind of worked its way into what we might call a frozen conflict or a bit of a stalemate, in which borders were drawn not in the entirety of the Donbas region, but actually a borderline was drawn midway, kind of halfway through the Donbas region, with Ukrainian forces on one side and then the separatist forces on the other. Now, importantly, Russia would say, we are not fighting this war. These are just Russian-speaking separatist peoples who we are supporting by some means. This is of course false. The Russians were sending in their own men, they were sending in troops, they were sending intelligence officers. They were obviously very deeply involved in this conflict, despite this plausible deniability throughout the entirety of it up until recently. We think about 4,000 Ukrainians died in this conflict, a couple thousand Russians or people from the Donbas region. And we're talking a lot obviously about refugees in the last month, but 1.5 to 2 million people were internally displaced within Ukraine as a result of this conflict, right? So this was a major turning point in the history of independent Ukraine, and it would never really resolve. There was a ceasefire agreement. You've probably heard references to this, called Minsk II, because this is where this was signed. This ceasefire is signed in 2015, but again, people are still being killed. Frozen conflict, or this kind of the verbiage we use is sometimes a little euphemistic, because people are still dying. There's still shelling going on. There's still civilians being killed. Sometimes up to 100 people, sometimes a little less every year, were still being killed in this conflict up until this past year, this past fall. And this is when we saw the buildup on the borders. You probably all saw the satellite images that we were showing up in our newspapers and on our websites. No one reads the newspaper anymore, on our websites and on our TVs, right? In late fall of 2021, hundreds of thousands, 200,000 Russian troops on the borders. And in this, as you all now remember, this is recent memory, the big question was, what is Russia planning to do here, right? Are they trying to, when we were all taking our guesses as experts, I was actually teaching a class on mass violence in 20th century Eastern European history at the time, and I actually started teaching this. I taught this class for the first time in 2015, I believe, and I've update this last lecture every year, even though the rest of the course is about the past. And I finished this lecture by saying to the students, here's an image of these Russian troops. We don't know what's going to happen. And we talked about it. And a lot of the guesses were maybe this is trying to end this conflict in the Donbas. Maybe there's some other kind of limited incursion that might happen, right? No one was really entirely sure, but most people and most experts did not believe that a full invasion would happen for a number of reasons we can talk about, but it really seemed like a crazy thing to do that would not accomplish what Russia's goals were for Ukraine, which was getting the West uninvolved, keeping Ukraine out of NATO, and some other quote unquote security concerns. That was really the last thing most people thought. And people I would trust way more than myself who know Russian politics and the Russian military, most people thought that was the last thing on the table. As we got towards late February, this seemed to be that this might be the case. And then obviously on February 24th, as we now all know and all saw, there was a massive land invasion of Ukraine, basically on 3 different fronts: the continuing fighting in the Donbas, which I've hopefully laid out for you, an attack from the north through Belarus, and actually through the Chernobyl region, which I'm sure I was a little too young for that, but many of you remember Chernobyl, which would head towards Kiev, and then an attack from the south out of Crimea into this kind of southeastern, we refer to this either as the south or the southeastern part of Ukraine, to capture some of these Russian-speaking cities in the south. So this 3-front war was launched. And our impressions now are that the goal was to basically decapitate the leadership in Kiev in days and take the capital. The question, we still don't know what the plans were, whether they were going to try to hold the capital or the country for a long period of time, or simply put another government in place. That is it's unclear what they had intended to do. But as we now know, that did not happen well. The operation did not go well. They were unable to capture Kiev quickly. There was been a lot of resistance, both from the Ukrainian military as well as civilians who are serving in defense forces, as well as even just regular people supporting this effort. So the war has not gone well for the Russians, as I think we've all seen by now. They've recently just pulled out of Kiev, and it seems as if there's a regrouping phase that's happening at the moment. And then the big question is going to be what's going to happen next. Are they going to try to carve out areas in southern part of Ukraine? Are they going to try to carve out the Donbas? Is there going to be there's some other option that we don't understand that's on the table right now? But that's where we're at. So hopefully that's a useful just kind of summary to bring us up from 2014 to the present. And I will stop here. I don't want to keep talking, at least in this form. And then I'll turn it back over to Josh.
Thank you very much. So friends, this is a Q&A. It's not often we get an expert that we just get to ask questions of. So I invite you to submit your questions. You can submit them through the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. You can also chat me if you like and send over a question. But while we're waiting for people to sort of queue their questions up, I do have a couple of my own. The first of which is, and maybe it's not quite clear yet, but from what you can tell, if this conflict was essentially frozen for the better part of 5 or 6 years, what changed? Like what changed to prompt a full-scale invasion? I mean, it's a very different state of a conflict.
Yeah. No, and it's an escalation on a magnitude. It's such a massive escalation on a magnitude almost unheard of in this kind of scenario, that it's real. Which is, I think, why so many people thought that this was entirely not possible. One thing to just say, we don't think that the aims could be accomplished through this type of action, but it's also, as the way you just framed it was helpful. Such an escalation that it almost, why would you wouldn't take 5 steps at once. You would probably maybe work your way up the steps. And also that in terms of negotiation strategies and international relations strategies, that would be a better way to do it, is to gradually gradually escalate and see what you're getting as a part of the process. Now, in many ways, it's still a million. And I should say, as a historian, we're used to very much dealing with things decades ago. I mean, the big joke is always, when does the history begin? You know, is it 2 decades, 3 decades? So, and obviously, when sort of world historic events, or events that we know that we're going to be living with and debating for a very long time, I think maybe I'd like to think historians might process these a little bit different in the present and try to think about this in the long term and ask bigger questions. So there's a number of things about this conflict that I think it might be a long time until we get a very clear answer about. And obviously, for the time being, we can just speculate. So when it comes to this question of why now, why not 3 years ago, why not a year ago, why not a year from now, it's really hard to say. So some people think that it had to do with the situation in Europe and the United States. Obviously, the adversaries are the people with whom he's going to have to negotiate any kind of security arrangement with Ukraine. That he thought that given the change of leadership in Germany at the time, that there was there's other questions about whether Merkel understood him better, was able to deal with him better, but now he thought he could get one over on the Germans. That they thought that Biden, given the drawdown in Afghanistan, given politics in the United States, that the U.S. would not be as interested in dealing with this, that they were sort of turning away from Europe. So there's some questions about the kind of geopolitical landscape that maybe said this is the time is ripe to move now, and we can sort of exploit weaknesses among European partners, obviously. And this is something that is talked about not as much, but there's a lot of strife within the European community right now. There's not, I mean, we just saw an election in Hungary a day ago. There's not a lot of unity in the European Union when it comes to a lot of issues. And so if you're Putin, you might be thinking, well, now's a good time. Similar, and a lot of the kind of main comparisons are, in terms of previous moves, is obviously what we just talked about of seizing Crimea. The Donbas did not go accordingly, right? They were not able to siphon those regions off in a clear, clean way that they had with Crimea. And then, of course, this intervention in Georgia in 2008, which some of you may remember, which was a very limited military intervention to help a breakaway region break off of Georgia. And this was likely in response to Georgia potentially joining NATO in the future as well. So those kind of clean, quick maneuvers, which they're able to meet their military objectives and also their kind of geopolitical objectives without a lot of pain. We think that was we think that's modeled what they wanted to do here. But that's, as we now know, the European Union acted in a very unified way. The United States has stepped up in a big way in response, and then there's been a lot of people coming on board together in the community, the larger Western community in response to this. So we think that obviously that was a misplay on their part, but that's at least one theory. A lot of other theories were about internal issues. So this has been floated a lot, that sometimes presidents or leaders of nations will use foreign policy or external events in response to things at home. Russia's a bit of a black box politically in terms of high politics. So it's a lot of speculation. Was there something going on among the leadership? Did he feel threats? And therefore he was using this at the time to kind of rally around the flag moment. So there's, and I shall say, as we look at things historically, it may not be one of these. We maybe 50 years from now, we get a document. It may not just say, well, it was just because we thought the Germans were too weak and now was the time to move. It could have been sort of a mix of different issues at once. And so yeah, that's a long way of saying we will find out. But there are a lot of different things in play that could have really led to this moment being the time to strike.
Absolutely, which brings us to our first community submitted question, and obviously, feel free to say where your area of expertise covers and where it might not.
Sure.
But in response to the last discussion, the question was posed: is it possible that I'm trying to paraphrase the question here. Is it possible that the disunity in the European Union and the perceived weakness of the European Union was actually the result of, or perceived to be the result of, Russian efforts to destabilize through electronic means and through social media manipulation?
I would, so on that issue in general, and we don't have to we don't have to get into the 2016 election here, or the last election, unless you really want to, but that's not really, obviously not my expertise. I would say, in terms of Russian meddling, let's just say more generally, right? Whether it's in Europe, whether it's even in some of their own affairs, whether it's the United States, more generally, I would say they are opportunistic, right? I don't think, and I put my cards on the table. I think this is the situation in the United States as well, with regards to Russia, right? I don't think Russia one is competent enough to create the problems that they're seeking to kind of intervene or to tweak or to poke. I think these are pre-existing fissures in society and tensions within society. So whether that's things that are going on in Poland, things that are going on in Hungary, other issues on the European continent. I think these are pre-existing issues, some of which have been exacerbated again by national politics and other European political situations, which are probably on their own course, I think. And yes, Russia has sought to exacerbate some of these things, and it's probably fair to say they've been more successful at some of these attempts than others, propping up and supporting illiberal regimes, obviously closer to their border, and even some of these kind of movements in other countries around Europe or around the world who are anti-democratic and such. So yeah, I think that the Russians have sought to exploit them, and I should also maybe put another wrinkle in there. They've sought to exploit them, but not necessarily for any kind of clear ideological agenda. And so there's often reference to Russia in terms of being a cynical actor, and I actually happen to think that that's actually quite useful, right? I think the Russians and Putin are interested in their own security issues. I think they're also interested in acting out certain grievances that they have with the West over the past 30 years. I think we can have different judgments about whether any of these things are reasonable or not, or how we want to view them. But when it comes to their interventions and their reactions to these things, I think they're often trying to exploit things for their own good, not necessarily to kind of create a better future. And I think a lot of this pushback against democratic institutions and all these things, it's not that, and this is maybe a separate conversation, there isn't much that the Russians have offered to put in its place. Simply being against something is not being for something, right? And so I think the Russians have often been, and this is, I think, perhaps, and this is very disappointing, and I think frustrating to a lot of people, including a lot of Russians, that this is just cynical behavior. So exploiting right-wing groups or far right-wing groups or other kind of anti-democratic actors in different societies and trying to give them exposure, trying to cause conflicts, right? That's not done towards any sort of obvious end other than just causing problems. And that's just a kind of cynical intervention, right? And so I think that that's often what is driving a lot of this. And so my short answer, yeah, I think problems exist. I think problems already existed. The Russians made some worse than others. I think some get a little bit overplayed due to people not wanting to take responsibility for these problems in their own countries. But yeah, that would be how I would approach that.
Thank you. Our next question is in reference to Putin himself, and certainly it's hard to know the psychology of somebody, but we do have a certain amount of historical evidence to support, give some sort of idea of how Putin acts and potentially thinks. And the question is, do you think Putin would accept defeat? And is there anyone or anything that could influence him to withdraw without losing face?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's another one of these things that sort of TBA, right? We're trying to figure out we're in a kind of holding pattern right now for the moment, or things are changing a little bit, and so we're not. It's a little unclear what the next phase is going to be and how the Russians are going to regroup and react to what's going on. It's clear the war sadly does not look like it's going to end tomorrow or next week, but we're in a kind of transitionary period. Now, I mean, it's important, and I didn't put this in my original comments, and so I'm glad you asked this question. It's an opportunity just to say something about this now. And I actually, a lot of the questions I was getting from the media and other people and my students and everyone early on, right, was the justification for the war, right? And so we saw Putin on these addresses. I think this was the one. I mean, these sort of things are now just sort of, I think, like, you know, seared in my mind. I can't always even remember the date. It was the early in that week, but I think it was the Monday before the invasion started. There was the address, this kind of scowling, nasty address on national television, and where he gave some of these justifications, right? And he mentioned, he used this term denazification, which I think a lot of folks were confused about in the West. What are we talking? You know, what is he talking about? Fascist, and he used some other kind of historical terminology, which we don't have to get into right now. And this was kind of coupled with what I just laid out about what seemingly were the operation's early objectives, which was to take out, which was regime change, right? We're familiar with this term from our own experience, recent history. So the idea here was explicit regime change, right? We're going to come in, we need to denazify it. We're going to, what better regime to get rid of than a regime of Nazis, right? That's something, you know, historically we can all agree upon, right? So denazification, regime change. But we've already seen a move on that, right? So regime change, that language has been dropped. And this is typical, I think, to most wars and conflicts, right? People are going to recalibrate based on whatever they were to accomplish, what their original goals were versus what they would accomplish versus what it's going to cost them moving forward, right? And so we've already seen regime change drop. Denazification doesn't seem to be the kind of driving rationale anymore, and we're already seeing recalibration towards things that were the original driving goals, but then they're kind of dressed up in these more fantastical things to meet the more fantastical options that they put on the table. So now we're looking at things like you know, the status of Ukraine and becoming sort of a, you know, potentially kind of a neutral power in the region. Other things are being put on other things are at least part of these negotiations, which we don't really have a full window into between the two powers. And so, yeah, so that's just a short way that's kind of a long way of saying, well, here we're in a place where there's already been a bit of a pullback from what the original stance was. Now, that doesn't mean that someone like Putin, who one should probably fear for his own security if he was to admit defeat. And there's really nothing about what we know about him as a person, even though we can't get into his brain, but there's nothing that we've seen about him and his history to say that he's somebody that's just going to call it a day and pull all the troops out of Ukraine. Even if he was someone who wanted to do that, he might not do that because that doesn't seem to be in his interest. That wouldn't be into his interest of potentially getting deposed, or who knows what could happen politically in Russia if that were the case. So that doesn't mean, yeah, they're going to just say no. So, but that leaves other things on the table between, we're going to try to basically destroy a sovereign country's government versus we have these demands for the Donbas region, or we have these demands for neutrality for Ukraine moving forward. And as most political leaders may do, he might be able to go, I mean, he doesn't have to worry about like an election or responding to his party or responding to the media or any of the other things that leaders of democratic countries do. He can go back home and say, you know, or maybe we did denazify Kiev, but you know, we got our ultimate demands, which we wanted. He won't use the word denazification anymore, but he'll say, we got neutrality, we got a hard no on NATO, and it will paint it as a victory, right? And that will then kind of become the narrative. But again, how do we get there, and where that place is where they do remove the troops and stop the shelling of cities and doing all these other things, and there's some sort of agreement that's brokered to get there, that obviously remains to be seen. So.
Oh, 1 second. There we go. So another question that popped up, oddly relevant to this discussion, is from the Ukrainian side. What can we expect that they would find palatable in some sort of negotiation, and in sort of, you know, obviously you're an historian, you look back as opposed to looking forward. But if you were to sort of open your crystal ball and say, you know, these are the 5 most likely outcomes, you know, regardless of how long it takes us to get there, what might you think the end game would look like?
Generally speaking, or what the Ukrainians would like the end game to be?
Well, I think it was a 2-part question. So
Okay.
sort of what would the Ukrainians find palatable? And then what
Right.
do you think will actually happen?
Right. So that's a very complicated question. So from the Ukrainian side, and here, and this is, I was on a panel with some colleagues the other day, and this point came up, and I think it, and I touched on it in my opening comments, and I'll reiterate it here just because I think it adds a little bit of color and nuance to the situation. So I gave you a number early on about perceptions of the European Union versus a customs union with Russia early on. It was not a majority of Ukrainians that wanted to be in the European Union. And so similarly, if you look to questions about NATO, which I'm surprised we're 40 minutes into this and no one's asked about NATO yet, but or maybe that's just where we are. It's been 6 weeks and there's less questions about NATO. But if you looked at, for instance, NATO, and I'll come back to the answer in a second. So 2008, this is when this kind of whatever this, they had some just ridiculous phraseology that was used at the time to refer to this invitation, this future potential invitation sometime in the future, right? That the Bush administration did in 2008 for Ukraine to potentially join NATO as well as Georgia, right? And this was a government at the time. This was the government that preceded this Yanukovych government. And this is, of course, I mean, some of these things when you're trying to explain Eastern European history to people, and there's 5 names for every town, and then some towns were in 7 different countries in 100 years, right? So Yushchenko, who some of you may remember, this was the president who was poisoned during the election this was around the Orange Revolution, 2005, and he had been a much more although he was a bit of a slippery character, but he had been a much more Western-oriented politician. And he wanted to put Ukraine on this track to become a part of Europe. And part of that story was joining NATO. Now, at the time when this invitation was floated to Ukraine, not to join, but to potentially join, the number of percentage of Ukrainians that wanted to join NATO was something like 20%, right? Was extremely low. And here you had a politician, an elite, right? And there's a huge divide between the people who run the country in Ukraine and then average citizens. Here you had a Western-oriented elite person who wanted to drive the country in one direction. We had Yanukovych, who took over, right, who wanted to push the country towards Russia, despite that being a vast minority of people who wanted that direction. So there's often this disjuncture between ruling elites in Ukraine and then what popular perceptions are, or what direction that the country actually wants to go in. Now, what's been interesting about the conflict over the last 15 years, or kind of putting this in the continuum with 2005 revolution, right, is that all of these interventions that Russia have made, either economically, militarily, in terms of propaganda, information war, all this stuff. All the interventions that Russia has made have actually pushed Ukrainians on a whole away from Russia, right? So perceptions of NATO were over 50% in the days leading up to the war, right? So you had a place where a huge minority of Ukrainian, or a small minority wanted to join NATO 15 years ago. Now, after these events of 2014 to the present, that people see this, who perhaps otherwise a lot of Ukrainians preferred, the majority of Ukrainians up until 2014, the majority were in the camp of let's stay out of things, or let's find some sort of neutral place to be. And so these interventions have actually had the opposite effect of bringing Ukraine quote unquote closer to Russia, and actually turning a lot of people who were in the neutral camp to it's probably better to be with the West if this is how the Russians are going to act. This is what the situation is. So that's all just to say that even though you now have, and we're not talking 80-90% of the country, right? It's still a complex place. And now some of that polling may change after they get around to interviewing people after they've had their family members killed or had their city shelled for 4 weeks. It's gonna, I don't know that the the appreciation for joining the custom unions with Russia is going to be high in Kharkiv after the last month, which is the insanity of it is almost too much to bear. So we might see those numbers go up even more. But that's all just to say of what would Ukraine want for the future, given the direction it was going in, and how much that's changed over the last 10 or 15 years, and then also what this conflict will do to it, and also what does the leadership or the elite think that they're able to, what are their actual goals? And I have to say, most Ukrainian presidents and leadership are usually doing what's best for them, and not what's best for the country. So what is their position going to be, and what do they think what do they think is either best for themselves and or Ukrainians given the current conflict? And look, within 48 hours of the war starting, Zelensky was already putting on the table Ukrainian neutrality to some degree. So it seems as if, and we're not totally sure what's being put on the table, but it's possible that is at least this kind of military security neutrality could be something that the Ukrainians are willing to do. And so that would mean maybe a guarantee that we're not going to join NATO from them, rather than coming from the Germans or the French, who said they would veto it. So some sort of neutrality there, saying we won't let the U.S. send in weapons, we won't let U.S. advisors into the country, something like this. But maybe they give that away, but then they say, but we also want to join the European Union. So that's kind of more the kind of social economic aspect of it. So maybe that's a kind of something, that's the kind of divide that they're willing to live with. And then obviously there's a lot more complicated but bigger questions about what happens to these territories in the south and the east, whether Russia wants to break them away, whether they stay in Ukraine. I mean, I think it's been very obvious from the reactions of both the last government and this current Zelensky government that no one's willing to just part with territories, which obviously most leaders of most countries are not going to say, sure, you can have Texas, right? So that's usually not how they're going to react. And I don't think that they think that that's going to be a viable option, but there could be degrees of agreement that could happen, of saying there's this big question about kind of federalizing or sort of allowing higher autonomy in certain regions, right? A number of countries do this to a degree. So kind of allowing greater autonomy for these Russian speaking regions, as that some kind of sort of, political solution to the situation. So that's a long way of kind of answering this question about what Ukraine wants. And I'll put this out here too. And this is something I think about, and some of my other colleagues think about as well. That's maybe short term of what can be agreed upon to stop the killing and stop the fighting, and some sort of geopolitical agreement about where Ukraine should fall in the security order and in Europe and its relationship with Russia and the West. And that could be put in place to end the war. And that's kind of the near term. But the far term, and this is what's worrying to people who study war and violence for a job, is you don't necessarily know what even in the kind of medium term, what could happen, right? Because this is wars and these conflicts, what it does to societies, what it does to the people who are traumatized, what it does to the people who fight in them. These people eventually come home and the fighting stops, and then they have to live with the consequences of whatever was decided upon, right? We don't need a history lesson about what happened after World War I, or even to a degree, some of the stuff happened after World War II, or that was dealt with a lot better. So some of the fears are that even though we know the far right in Ukraine is not well represented politically, has very few people in the government. The far right-wing parties have done worse since the Maidan revolution. The fears are that there could be a political arrangement agreed upon, but there could be actually pushback from below in Ukrainian society. And it's not to judge that. I mean, obviously, if it's a kind of a nasty far right reaction, I think we'll probably say that would be bad for everybody. But there could be pushback from below if there's some sort of agreement reached to end this conflict that they don't want to live with. And then that puts, that could lead to instability, that could lead to future problems. And so that's in kind of in the back of my head where I think, well, yes, let's find an arrangement that stops people from dying. But it's scary to think about what comes after that. Is it going to be, we're going to rebuild the country and rebuild the system and deal with corruption and have a balanced relationship with Russia and the West? Is that even possible with someone like Putin in charge? Is that possible if there's a new president in the US or different leadership in Europe? I think I think some of the longer term stuff is also important to think about right now, because we don't know what's going to happen. And I think hopefully in that answer, I've also kind of talked about some things that are potentially on the table to kind of end this conflict from both sides. And I also think in the previous question we addressed some potential Russian outcomes that they could, at least, or we should say, I mean, I say Russian, but outcomes that Putin can live with, because ultimately it's going to be his decision, and he's not going to have to answer to anyone else about that. So.
Sorry, almost lost my computer there. One last quick question on this subject matter, which is, you bring up the role, the potential for instability. What role does the general instability of U.S. foreign policy have to play with, with what's happened in Ukraine and what potentially could happen in the future? I know, as a limited student of history, sometimes our consistent changing of foreign policy with changing administrations can drive European countries a little nuts.
Yeah, and I probably, well, and I think a lot of that question has been, the way to answer that question in the past has often been linked to kind of issues around NATO, because that seems to be one of the bigger issues on the table when it came to Ukraine. But even if we think about the recent past, I mean, it's. I don't know how many people remember. I mean, obviously, the whole issue with the first Trump impeachment, right, had to do with the call to Zelensky, right? And this was Zelensky asking for, asking for aid, and then Trump essentially saying that obviously wanted to have him to do him a favor, or whatever he meant to say. So this had to do with United States potentially helping Ukraine and prepare for what we're seeing today. And this question also. And it's also important to point out, right? So, I mean, the Obama administration did not want to give lethal weapons because they saw, or well, I don't know the classifications, but wanted to avoid certain types of weapons because they saw this. They knew that the Russians would see this as a provocation. The Trump administration kind of rolled that back. There wasn't a huge. There wasn't a huge movement, at least as far as I'm aware of any kind of real kind of policy change that happened on the Trump administration. I mean, there was obviously the tensions around NATO and the threats to leave NATO or undermine it. And I don't know it. I'm unclear how the Russians would have read that. But there wasn't a lot, at least in terms of kind of actionable changes in foreign policy when it came to the Trump administration. And then for what we're seeing now, which has been in many ways either kind of obviously an escalation given what's actually happened with the war, of sending even more weapons than obviously they were sending before it. And that's a good question. That's something I'd probably have to think over more than I can right now, what a future scenario would look like. I mean, for the most part, I would say you're unlikely historically to see any major break or vacillation when it came to U.S. foreign policy, just from changing of presidents, right? So if, let's just say, there was if there was a Republican president who took over after the next election, I don't think you would see too much movement that would have a massive effect on the conflict or the direction moving forward. Even for all the discussion, which obviously I think Trump definitely changed a lot of things about how domestic issues were dealt with or done. And there was a lot of talk about America first and drawing back from foreign conflicts, but there were also lots of continuities, even between him and the Obama years, and then continuities that continue in terms of foreign policy to the present. So for all the kind of bluster about the change in foreign policy, there wasn't necessary. I mean, it wasn't like they cut the military budget in half and decided we weren't going to keep our promises to certain European countries. So yeah, I would say I wouldn't say that there's necessarily I wouldn't be worried about that tipping the boat in the short term. I think there's bigger. I mean, the elephant in the room has always been the kind of the NATO question about what is actually the defined relationship between the United States and Ukraine? What is its vested interest? And that has been something I've actually seen a lot of good writing and good discussion about from political scientists and international relations scholars, sort of gaming out some of these issues. when it's come to Western or U.S. involvement in Ukraine, and what role that has played in kind of not causing the war, because the United States, the United States and the EU and NATO did not cause the war. Putin caused the war, but decisions that had been made by Western leaders since, I mean, we can kind of game it out since 91, decisions that have been made by Western leaders, US presidents, other important people that helped set up some of the structural situations that kind of, didn't create the conflict, but were an important part of the story. And there's been a lot of it. There's been just a lot of really smart people talking about what was driving NATO decision making in the 90s, or people around NATO about letting these countries in, about growing NATO, like how much reflection was there at the time about, again, not just short-term gains of, oh sure, Slovenia and Poland want to join NATO, that sounds like a great thing, let's let them in, and it's written into the charter, there's this quote unquote open door policy, so that's all fine and well, but sort of asking what were the, are there long-term consequences to this? What are the actual long-term goals of NATO? And it's been fascinating to hear people, these sort of expert NATO experts kind of talk about this. And at least from all the information I've consumed, I'm not a NATO expert, that there really wasn't a lot of reflection at all, actually, about the long-term consequences. And that, I think, to me, that's some of the, at least in terms of foreign policy, and these takeaways here is that, and I think obviously the more kind of famous historical, the towering figures of foreign policy in the United States and other places are people that did understand their history, did understand long-term trajectories, did understand that the moves they make now could affect something a generation from now. There doesn't seem to have been a whole lot of that going on in the 1990s. That's at least my takeaway from a lot of the recent discourse. But
there wasn't a lot of thought invested in hairstyles in the 90s either. So,
or other fashion choices.
So as we start to wrap up, I have a couple sort of rapid fire questions for you. The first is, as an historian and someone who has considerable knowledge of the region, if you were to recommend a book or an author that we should turn to if we really wanted to become a little bit better versed, other than your published articles, of course.
Probably avoid those. A little too detailed. Oh boy. That one I'm gonna, so in terms of popular writing, I'm trying to think like sort of more like kind of general histories of Ukraine or on the current conflict, or
sure, anything or anything.
You kind of got me on the spot with that one. I'm gonna have to say, well, look, I mean, things that are good entry points. There's there was obviously there's people like Tim Judah, and there were other reporters who did good reportage on issues around the Maidan Revolution. So there's I would say Tim Judah was a good reporter who did a lot of work on that. More kind of general histories or consumable histories of Ukraine. I'm probably the most readable person and most accessible person. I would definitely say is Tim Snyder, which I'm sure a lot of people know, and people, very consumable, easy to read, synthesizing book about 20th century Eastern European history. Is this book called Bloodlands, a lot of people read. There's some concerns with the book on some scholarly debates, but in terms of just sort of maybe getting to know the region and understanding a lot of the underlying historical, various animuses and other issues, I think it's a nice introduction to the region. I may have also just said that book because it's the first book I saw lying on my floor, but I was using it at the Prepo lecture yesterday. But no, I think. I think that's a good book. Serhiy Plokhy, Polkhy, is another scholar at Harvard who's written a few books. And actually, you know what? And I will plug a friend and colleague, is Serhiy Yekelchik. So that's Yekel. Chyk, so Yakelchik, who teaches in Canada. I'm not even going to remember the Canadian school right now. Teaches in Canada, but he's done a number of kind of short histories of Ukraine. And there was this book that I had been actually perusing recently, something like, everything you want to know about Ukraine or something like this. But he's done a number of very kind of short histories of Ukraine that are very readable. And he's a great scholar, and he's also done a lot of public intervention work. And so that's I would definitely put him out there as well. He's obviously from Ukraine. And so the Kelchik, Snyder, Plochy, these are kind of these are superstars that write about the history that I'd recommend.
Thank you. I'll probably get the exact spelling
Sure.
your
Sure.
Yes, so some folks were looking about names and books in the chat box. What I'm going to do is I'll get the names and some of the books, and we will add them to our website on Ukraine so that people can get a little bit more educated on it. If for those of you who don't know, it's wisela.org. /Ukraine. It spearheads all of our efforts. This obviously is not simply an academic question for our community. We have many members who trace their lineage to Ukraine.
Sure.
Also, simply as we prepare to celebrate Passover, the idea of how to assist oppressed peoples, especially those people fleeing violence, is one that's currently on our minds. A quick reminder to everyone here that we're currently supporting a wonderful effort with United Hatzalah and Congregation B'nai Jeshurun from New Jersey. Recently landed a plane with, I believe it was 156 refugees in Tel Aviv through the fundraising efforts of the congregation. That fundraising effort still goes on. You can support it right now, wisela.org /Ukraine, as well as hopefully we'll have this discussion up for you to review, as well as the names of the books. But as you discussed, as you suggested to me earlier, this is no longer an academic question, even at a university. People are getting involved and supporting different efforts. Do you mind telling us really quickly sort of what's going on at UCLA?
Sure. Yeah. So generally, right. There's been a global movement to try to take care of our Ukrainian friends and colleagues, some of whom are trapped in Ukraine, some of whom are in other places. I mean, I currently have a colleague who's a historian of Jewish background, who I met years ago, who's sort of, I would say, like a mentor-like figure, and he had actually served in the Soviet army, and as a result of that was on mobilization lists, and he's now been mobilized to fight. He's 55 years old. He's a well-known historian and is actually currently fighting in this conflict. And I had another friend of mine who's a historian who was in Romania when the war started and was stranded. So she's been in a small Romanian town for 6 weeks, who's another young and promising historian. So it's all just to say we have a lot of colleagues who are in bad shape and need a lot of help. And so 2 efforts at UCLA where I work, one through the Levy, so a lot of you hopefully know the Levy Center, the Jewish Studies Center at UCLA. So thanks to the Levy Center's amazing generosity and the support of a lot of endowed professors at UCLA, they're able to put together one fund already for a visiting graduate student. So this is to take a Ukrainian student, they can be of any background, but Ukrainian student who works on issues related to Jewish studies, doesn't have to just be the Holocaust, anything related to Jewish studies in Ukraine, to come to UCLA for a year. So that grant has already been set up, but we'd like to bring more graduate students in. So there's, we can share a link, but there's, that's a fund that if people want to donate, that's great, to bring in graduate students to get them out of Europe. And also, it's not just the war, but also the exposure and the support of Western universities would be a big deal for them. And then also the Center for European Studies at UCLA is also trying to create a similar fellowship, which doesn't exist yet because it needs to be funded, to bring over Ukrainian an actual scholar. So it's just not someone who's a graduate student, to bring someone as a kind of a visiting position for a year or two. And so that I'm involved in those efforts right now. So, these are there's a million things to support. Those are just two that I'm affiliated with, but anything I know so many people from our own synagogue, and then obviously from the LA Jewish community and Jewish communities all over the world. That's one of the things I think that I hope makes us all the most proud about being Jews is stepping up for people when they need help, and a lot of Ukrainians need our help right now. So yeah, I'm really excited to hear about the efforts at your synagogue, like so many of them. So it means a lot to me personally. So.
It means a lot to me personally that you made yourself available and that we could share you with our congregation. You truly are. You're truly a treasure, not only to the Jewish community, but to the academic community at large. And I hope the next time we do this, it won't be in response to violence, but rather just as a search to learn more about our history, our roots, and how we can have a better impact on the future. But thank you so much for your time, of course, and your words and your thoughtfulness. Thank you so much to our community members for attending, and those who weren't from our community. We're pleased to have you here with Dr. Jared McBride from UCLA. I'm Rabbi Josh Knobel from Stephen Wise, and it was a pleasure. We hope to see you again soon, and take care.
Thanks, everybody.